Welcome to the Tales of Deception YouTube channel. This is a place where we explore intriguing stories and the hidden facets of family and social relationships to broaden our perspectives on life. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can experience these profound and fascinating stories together every day. Today, I'm sharing a story about a wife who made decisions that deeply affected her relationship with her husband and her family. These choices led to changes that could never be undone. Let's dive into the story now.
This was supposed to be the perfect getaway, an opportunity for Charlotte and me to reconnect. I had spent an entire week researching, planning, and booking a 5-star resort in Mexico. I had everything carefully arranged, the perfect balance of adventure for Charlotte and relaxation for myself. I believed this trip would bring us closer together, reignite the spark in our marriage. But the moment I presented the idea to her, I realized I had made a mistake. The tension between us was undeniable, and instead of gratitude, all I received was anger and disappointment. Charlotte's reaction caught me off guard. I had hoped for at least a little appreciation, but all I saw was disappointment. "I can't believe you planned this entire trip without asking me," she said. Her voice full of anger. It felt like a punch to the gut. I tried to explain, but her eyes, those eyes, seemed to see right through everything I did. No matter what I did. Even with the best intentions, it seemed to be wrong. What I had thought would be a pleasant surprise quickly turned into a massive argument. What was supposed to be a chance for us to start over was now turning into the end of our relationship. I had always considered myself the responsible one. The person who could make life easier by planning, organizing, and controlling everything around me. It was something that had come naturally, whether it was work, finances, or even our relationship. I thought that by controlling the smallest details, I could create the perfect environment for happiness. And so, when I planned this vacation for Charlotte, I truly believed it was the perfect gesture, something that would bring us closer. After all, I had put so much thought into it. I spent countless hours researching the best resort, picking out activities, and making sure the entire trip was as flawless as possible. I was convinced this trip would rekindle the spark in our marriage, bring excitement, and remind us of the love we once had. But the more I tried to control, the more I pushed Charlotte away. Her reaction was the last thing I expected. As I presented the trip, I was met with frustration, not excitement. Her face twisted in disbelief as she turned to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You planned all this without asking me?" Her voice was filled with anger, and it stung more than I expected. I had assumed she'd be overjoyed. I thought she would be thrilled that I had taken the time to plan something special for us. But instead, all I received was a cold, dismissive response. I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow. "I thought it would be a surprise," I said weakly. But it sounded like an excuse. Even to me. My intentions, however pure, seemed to have no place in our conversation. Every word I spoke made it worse. "It's supposed to be fun," I added, trying to keep my voice steady. But I could see in her eyes that she wasn't buying it. "You don't get it, do you?" she snapped, her frustration boiling over. "You always do this. You think you can plan happiness into our lives. But it doesn't work like that." Her words hit me hard, each one feeling like a slap in the face. In that moment, I realized that my need to control had suffocated her. The very thing I thought would bring us closer was the reason we were so far apart. Charlotte didn't want a life that was planned to the minute. She wanted something real. Something raw. Something unpredictable. It wasn't about the luxury or the convenience I offered, it was about the freedom to experience life as it came. I could see the weariness in her eyes. The exhaustion from living in a world where everything was always decided for her, where every moment was mapped out ahead of time. She was suffocating. Tired of my rigid control. Tired of living in someone else's idea of happiness. I could feel the distance between us grow. With every attempt I made to reassure her, to fix things, she pulled further away. What was supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect was quickly turning into another reminder of how disconnected we had become. I had been so focused on making everything perfect, on creating the perfect experience, that I forgot what really mattered, her feelings, her desires. That evening, I could see it. I saw her eyes wander as we walked through the resort. Her gaze following something, someone else. She seemed lost in thought, not with me, but with the world she longed for. It wasn't just the trip, it was everything. Her restlessness had been growing for months, perhaps longer. And there, in the middle of this paradise, I saw it for the first time. Charlotte needed something else. It wasn't me. Later that night, we went to the hotel bar. I hadn't realized how badly I was clinging to my image of us until I saw her, laughing, completely at ease, with Dylan. Dylan was everything I wasn't. He didn't need plans or schedules. He was free. He didn't try to control anything, not his time, not his emotions, not even Charlotte. He was living in the moment. And that was something Charlotte was starving for. His smile was magnetic, and when he spoke, she listened. She was captivated. I could see the spark in her eyes when he talked to her. The way her body leaned in closer, like she was hungry for every word he said. She laughed more than I had heard in weeks. I felt myself becoming invisible, a shadow of the man she used to need. I hated myself for thinking this way. But I couldn't deny it. Dylan was everything I wasn't. He was easy, relaxed, carefree. I had spent so much of my life focusing on the future. On controlling the future, that I had forgotten how to live in the present. And that's exactly what Charlotte was craving. I watched them talk for hours that night, her eyes never leaving him. My heart sank with each passing minute. The more I tried to pull her back into the version of life I had planned for us, the further she drifted into the version she craved. It wasn't just about the vacation anymore. It was about freedom, freedom I couldn't offer her. And it was about her needing to feel alive in ways I had long forgotten. As I watched them, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just the trip that was falling apart, it was everything. I had thought that by controlling the details, I could make everything right. But now, it felt like everything I had worked for was slipping away. And in that moment, I realized, I had no control over this anymore. What started as a casual drink with Dylan and Ava quickly turned into something more. At first, it seemed harmless, just a few drinks, a few laughs. And the kind of light-hearted conversation that makes time slip away without you noticing. But soon, Charlotte began spending more and more time with them, laughing louder, her face brighter. Her entire energy shifting. She was letting go of the stress she'd been carrying for months, shedding the weight of responsibilities, of routine, of a life that had felt too predictable for too long. And I watched it all from the sidelines. The more she spent time with Dylan and Ava, the more I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. There was a change in her. A transformation I couldn't quite put my finger on, but one that was undeniable. Charlotte was coming alive again, and it wasn't with me. It was with them. With him. I had seen this version of Charlotte before, the version of her that was free, spontaneous, and full of life. It had been a long time since I'd seen her like that. And I hated myself for realizing that I had stopped being the one who could make her feel that way. Dylan made her feel things I could no longer give her. She laughed more now. And it was a genuine laugh, not the kind of polite chuckles she used to give me when I cracked a joke that fell flat. She smiled wider. Her eyes sparkled with something I hadn't seen in years, something that used to be only for me. I used to be the one who made her feel that way. And now, here she was, giving it to someone else. The pang of jealousy in my chest was sharp. I could feel it, the heavy, gnawing sensation that spread every time I saw her interact with him. I tried to ignore it. Tried to tell myself it was nothing, that she was just having fun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why was she spending so much time with him? Why was she looking at Dylan the way she used to look at me when we first met? There was a certain intensity in her gaze, a curiosity, a longing, something I hadn't seen in her in years. It was a look I used to get when I made her feel special, when we were still new to each other, when we were still discovering the world together. But now, that look was reserved for him. I felt a deep sense of loss, like I had been replaced by a man who didn't even have to try. Then, one night, Dylan invited us to an underground club. It was secretive. A place that felt a little dangerous, a little illicit, the kind of place where rules didn't apply. But Charlotte was all for it. Her eyes lit up at the thought of it. And her excitement was contagious. "Come on, David," she said, her voice eager, almost pleading. "Let's just try it. Live a little." Her words stung. There was a challenge in them. An unspoken question. Was I so predictable now? So boring that even the idea of stepping outside my comfort zone seemed like a revelation to her? I hesitated. I knew what this meant. I knew where this was headed. But the guilt gnawed at me. Guilt for being the one who held her back, guilt for not being the person who could show her something new, something exciting. I saw the sparkle in her eyes, the way she was glowing with the kind of energy I hadn't seen in ages, and I felt myself being pulled along by a mix of guilt and hope. Maybe I could still be that person for her. Maybe I could still give her the thrill she was craving. Maybe if I went along, I could prove to her that I wasn't just the man who planned every detail of her life. I followed her into the club, even though my gut twisted with uncertainty. The place was dark, the music loud. The air thick with the buzz of people letting go. The energy in the room was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was as if time stood still in the chaos, and everyone there was living for the moment. But there, in the middle of all that noise and movement, Charlotte was completely lost to me. She was with Dylan, dancing, laughing, as if nothing in the world mattered except the now. She was glowing, intoxicated by the music, the atmosphere, and yes, Dylan. It wasn't just that she was having fun. It was the way she was so absorbed in it, in him. I could see her leaning in closer to Dylan, her hand resting on his arm, her body moving in rhythm with his. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and it wasn't just the alcohol. It was the realization that I no longer had a place in her world. The feeling of being replaced was suffocating, a reminder of everything I had failed to be for her. I should have left. I should have walked away from that moment, from that feeling, but instead, I stayed. I told myself it was just a phase, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. And that shift would change everything. Inside the club, Charlotte was a completely different person. The music, loud and pulsing, seemed to flow through her. She was no longer the woman I had known for years, bound by the responsibilities of life. In that moment, she was free. Her body swayed to the beat, her face illuminated by the neon lights. And her laugh, it was full, unrestrained, and alive. It was as if the club had swallowed her whole, and she was no longer tethered to the life we had built. She danced with Dylan. Her movements fluid and carefree, the kind of movement I hadn't seen from her in so long. She laughed with Ava, her smile so bright and genuine it almost hurt to look at. They talked to strangers with ease, as if they had known them for years. In that crowd of strangers, Charlotte was at home, and I was the outsider. I was the ghost in her life. A silent observer watching as my wife slipped further away from me. Every laugh she shared, every touch between her and Dylan, every moment that passed seemed to drive a wedge deeper into my chest. I couldn't deny it anymore, I was losing her. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, but it wasn't until Dylan leaned in close to Charlotte, whispering something in her ear, that I truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. His voice was low, intimate, and for the first time, I felt like I didn't exist. I watched as his lips brushed her ear. His presence so close to hers that it seemed to consume her. She didn't pull away. She was listening, and in that moment, everything changed. "You know," Dylan said casually, his voice smooth. "We don't believe in rules." His words hung in the air, light but heavy with meaning. No jealousy, no boundaries. Just freedom. My heart sank. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My mind raced, and for the first time in a long time, I was utterly lost. This wasn't what I had signed up for. This wasn't the marriage I had imagined. It wasn't even close. How had we gone from a partnership to this? From promises and shared dreams to this? I stood there, frozen for a moment, caught in the reality of what was happening. Charlotte was looking at Dylan. Her eyes bright with curiosity, a look I hadn't seen in her for years. The desire to be free, to break free from the confines I had unknowingly built for her, was evident in her gaze. Dylan wasn't just talking about freedom, he was offering it to her. He was giving her something I couldn't, or perhaps wasn't willing to. And she was listening. "What do you think, Charlotte?" Dylan asked, his voice low and enticing. His question wasn't just about the club. It was about her life. About us. About everything we had built and where it was heading. "Are you ready for something real? Something without rules?" His words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I tried to pull her away, to remind her of what we had, of who we were. But the words that came out of my mouth didn't have the same power as Dylan's invitation to a new life, a life of no boundaries, no rules. "This isn't us," I said, my voice tight. Struggling to stay calm. The words felt heavy, but they weren't enough. "We don't need this." Charlotte pulled her arm away from me, the movement sharp. Like she was breaking free from something that had been holding her back. Her eyes flashed with irritation, and for a moment, I saw the anger rise in her. But it wasn't just anger. It was something else. It was frustration. It was the same frustration I had seen in her for months now, the same frustration that had built up when I had tried to make everything perfect for her. When I had tried to fix everything with my plans. "You don't get it, do you?" she snapped, her voice full of exasperation. "I need to breathe, David. I need freedom." Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. The truth was staring me right in the face, and I couldn't look away. Charlotte didn't need my control, my plans, my perfect vacations. She needed freedom. She needed space to be herself, to feel alive in ways I hadn't let her for so long. And just like that, our marriage was standing on the brink. I had thought I could fix everything, that with the right plans, with enough control, I could make everything work again. But in that moment, I realized that what Charlotte needed wasn't something I could provide. What she needed was something I wasn't willing to give her: freedom, independence. A life that wasn't ruled by my need for control. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that we could work through this. I wanted to remind her of the love we had. Of the life we had built together. But the truth was, she wasn't looking for that anymore. And deep down, I knew I wasn't the man who could give her what she wanted. The night had taken a turn I never anticipated, and I couldn't bear to stay another minute. As the music pulsed around me, my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't escape. I had to get out. I had to leave before the suffocating reality of what I was witnessing became too much to bear. So, I walked away. I left the club, the chaos, and Charlotte behind. I needed air. I needed space to think, to figure out what was happening. By the time I reached the hotel room, I could still feel the heavy weight of the night on my shoulders. My chest felt tight. And I knew I couldn't go back there, not yet. I told myself I needed a break, but deep down, I knew the truth. I needed distance, because what I had seen, what I felt, was already too much. Charlotte. Dancing so freely, her laughter lost in the noise, her body close to Dylan's in ways I hadn't seen in years. It was as if she had forgotten about me. Forgotten about us. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound, and I replayed the images in my mind over and over again. The way she looked at him. The way she moved with him. It was like I was invisible, a shadow in her life. I stayed in the room for a few hours, my thoughts a jumble of emotions. I waited, hoping that maybe I had overreacted. That maybe I was imagining things. I couldn't endure the uncertainty any longer. She was already hours late. I grabbed my things, packed hastily, and left the hotel. I didn't look back. I didn't even know if she would return that night. The thought of waiting in that room, trapped by my own emotions, felt like torture. But what I didn't know was that I had underestimated the level of betrayal that was already festering. The next morning, when Charlotte returned to the hotel room, she was drunk. Her steps unsteady as she staggered through the door. The smell of alcohol was unmistakable, clinging to her like a thick fog, a scent that I had learned to dread. And as I watched her walk in, my heart shattered. I stood in the doorway, numb, as I watched her trying to regain some balance, her eyes not meeting mine. The silence between us was unbearable. I had been waiting for this moment to confront her, but I didn't expect the weight of my own emotions to hit me so hard. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Trying to keep the shaking from my words. Charlotte didn't seem to care. She waved her hand dismissively, her face clouded with the remnants of the night's alcohol. "Relax, David. It was just a party." But I had seen enough. I couldn't just brush it off. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I had to know the truth, even if it hurt. I grabbed her phone. My fingers trembling as I flipped it open. And there it was, an image that shattered me. A picture of Charlotte and Dylan. Too close. Too intimate. The way they were looking at each other. The way their bodies were positioned. It was all too much. I stared at the photo, my heart racing with anger, with hurt, with betrayal. How could she do this? How could she let this happen? "Explain this," I demanded, my voice choking with fury. The words felt like they were strangling me, but I had to say them. I had to know. Charlotte's face turned pale as she saw the photo. Her lips stiffening in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. She stood there, frozen, caught in the truth of what had happened. I was just dancing," she said. Her voice weak, her words hollow. She was trying to convince me, trying to make it sound like it was nothing. But I knew. I knew this wasn't just some innocent dance. I stood there, staring at her. Unable to look away from the woman I had loved, the woman who had just shattered my trust. My mind was spinning. How had we gotten here? How had things gone so terribly wrong? I realized. In that moment, that this wasn't just about a spontaneous trip gone wrong. This wasn't about a one-off mistake or a lapse in judgment. No, this was something deeper. Something irreparable. The foundation of our relationship had cracked. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that sickening sense that everything I had known was slipping through my fingers. Charlotte was no longer the person I thought I knew. She was someone else, someone who had found freedom in someone else. She was someone who didn't need me anymore. And that realization hit me harder than any of the lies or secrets ever could. My heart shattered as I realized what had been happening behind my back. The realization was like a heavy weight settling on my chest, each breath becoming harder to take. Charlotte wasn't the woman I had married anymore. She had changed. And not just in the way I had expected. The person she had become was someone who had found something in Dylan that I couldn't give her. And that truth hurt more than anything I could have imagined. The pain was unbearable. It was the kind of pain that gnawed at the edges of every waking moment, that tightened around my chest with every thought of her. The realization that I had been blind to the distance growing between us, that I had missed all the signs, crushed me. But there was something else, a cold, bitter clarity that swept over me as I stood there, staring at the empty space she had left. I had to let her go. I knew that now. The answer was simple. Even though the path to it had been anything but. Charlotte had made her choice, and as much as it broke me to admit it, I couldn't make her choose me. I couldn't force her to stay. Couldn't beg her to love me the way she once had. The woman she had become was not someone who needed me anymore, and the woman I had been trying to hold on to was slipping through my fingers. The next few days felt like a blur. The world outside continued as usual, but inside my mind, everything was in chaos. Charlotte left the apartment, her things slowly disappearing, taking with them the remnants of a life I had built with her. I began packing her things, each item I touched a reminder of the person she used to be. The person I used to love. I didn't want to argue anymore. I didn't want apologies or justifications. I didn't need her to explain herself, I had seen enough. The damage had been done, and no amount of words could fix it. The hope I had once clung to had withered away. I had lost it, lost her, and I knew that fighting for something that was already gone was a futile effort. Packing her things was not an act of anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a quiet acceptance. An acceptance of the fact that we were over, that everything we had built was now just memories. It felt like I was erasing her from my life. But in truth, I was simply removing the clutter, the things that kept me chained to a version of reality that no longer existed. I walked out of the apartment. The weight on my shoulders lighter than it had been in months. My mind was clearer than it had ever been in a long time. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But in that moment, I realized that perfection wasn't what I needed. I didn't need to fix everything. I didn't need to control every part of my life. What I needed was freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom from the expectations. Freedom from the weight of a relationship that had turned toxic. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I had given up on chasing someone who didn't want to be caught. I had spent so long running after Charlotte, trying to bring back the love we once had, that I had forgotten what it felt like to just breathe, to be me again. I had been holding on to a version of us that no longer existed, and in letting go, I was finally free. It wasn't easy. It wasn't painless. But it was the right thing to do. As I walked away from the apartment, I knew that the hardest part was over. And though the future was uncertain, I was no longer afraid of it. I was free to move forward, to find a new path, to rebuild my life without the shadows of the past haunting me. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but each day, the weight on my chest became a little lighter. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, rediscovered old hobbies I had forgotten about. And for the first time in a long while, I found peace in the quiet moments. But it wasn't just about finding distractions. It was about understanding that letting go of the past was the only way forward. I had to accept that some chapters in life weren't meant to be rewritten. And sometimes, you have to lose something to gain something greater. I realized that, for all the pain and loss, this was the freedom I needed. The freedom to be myself again. To stop chasing a version of the future that no longer existed. Only by letting go could I truly create a future worth living for.
The story concludes with a powerful reminder of the lessons life often teaches us in the most unexpected ways. It's a reflection on trust, choices, and the consequences they carry. What do you think about this story? Feel free to leave your thoughts, comments, or reflections below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe. so you won't miss the next story that awaits us all. Let's continue this journey of discovery together.